This morning I read through part of Ezekiel, and Ezekiel is a prophet to the people of Israel. And the beginning of the book is very narrative. So most of the prophets, they just kind of prophesy, they're declaring the word of the Lord. But the beginning of Ezekiel is different. And in it, he tells a story about how in a vision he's brought to Israel. And remember, Ezekiel is an exile, which means that he was taken away from his land. He's sitting in Babylon with the other exiles of Israel. And some of the poor Israelites were left in Israel to maintain the land. Well, he's taken back there in a vision. And the people of Israel are doing things that are really, really just evil. I mean, they're sacrificing their babies to God. They're going into God's holy temple and desecrating it by worshiping false gods made by human hands. And in the middle of the 10th chapter, there's this really neat story. Now, God in Ezekiel is described as being surrounded by cherubim. And what's interesting about this is that in Isaiah 6 and Revelation 4, people that didn't communicate with each other are describing heaven in the same way. Ezekiel, Isaiah, and John all describe it in a similar fashion. Now, you may say John could have read Ezekiel and Isaiah, but Isaiah and Ezekiel definitely didn't read or even communicate with each other. So it kind of shows us a more pure vision of heaven. And each one of them describes heaven as in the center where the throne is, there's 4 living creatures. And they give different descriptions, or rather I should say, they focus on different parts of these living creatures. They never contradict each other. But in Ezekiel, he talks about how they're on wheels. So each living creature surrounding God on every side, and then they're on wheels. And so in the temple, it's almost as if heaven, like physically, I should say spiritually, was existing inside of the temple, even after the Israelites were carried off into exile. But because of the desecration of the temple, God decides to leave. It says in verse 18 of chapter 10, the glory of the Lord moved out from the entrance of the temple and hovered above the cherubim. As I watched, the cherubim flew with their wheels to the east gates of the Lord's temple, and the glory of God of Israel hovered above them. And then it talks about it leaving. Now, this is a huge deal because all the way back, so look how long this Bible is. All of this, all the way back into the middle of Leviticus, whenever they built the temple, the tabernacle, God's physical presence dwelled with the Israelites and then in Israel in the temple. He was there. Heaven existed with the Israelites. But then their sin caused a separation between them and God. Now, this is a problem that we actually face today. Did you know that your sin separates you from God? One of the biggest problems in my life, and something that the Lord is convicting me of as I've read through the Bible this year, is that I don't believe that my sin is as serious as God believes that it is. You ever thought about that? That your sin, what you've done in your life, is truly deserving of hell. But God viewed it as the people's sin here in the book of Ezekiel was worth him physically leaving their presence. Now, he didn't abandon his people, but he did leave them. He was still God. He's still controlling the heavens and the earth, but he left the temple. Now, oftentimes in our lives, we go, God, I want to do whatever I want, but I want you to bless me. Or God, I'm going to do whatever I want, but when my grandma gets sick, I'm going to pray to you and I want you to heal her. Or God, I'm going to do whatever I want, but I expect financial blessings to be poured out onto my life. In reality, we should be looking at how we can get into God's presence instead of focusing on him coming into ours. In other words, Jesus paid the fine for our sin already. And so we're washed in his blood. Instead of being entitled to God blessing our life, which we're not, we should be hungry and thirsty to become more a part of his presence. That's why it's so important when God left the temple physically, he did something he had never done before to show the severity of sin to his people. Just as the cross shows us the severity of sin now, this would have showed it to them then. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope it kind of challenges you to get a different perspective of the temple of God, and I hope to see you back here later as we continue to read through Scripture together.